a really good occasion also for us here in Lithuania to meet, but also with colleagues from Belarus who are really well-known specialists of Belarusian topics. The situation is really boiling, and Vilnius, as all Lithuania became, I can say, a spiritual capital of Belarusian events. So participation of Lithuanian in general, but also of our political elites, of our president, of our prime minister, activization toward Belarus is really huge. So I think we will start, as was decided before, we will start with short speeches at the beginning, and later I will open the floor for discussion. But at the beginning, short introduction speech, some theses I would like to ask at the beginning Professor Giedrius Česnakas from Military Academy. Giedrius, floor is yours, so 6-7 minutes, not longer. Later I will ask Sima Rakutienė. So we'll start from Giedrius. You are welcome, Giedrius.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Sure, yeah.
And when I was invited to participate in this event, I really hard thought about what to say, what we don't know still about Belarusian events, but I think we should look into a bigger geopolitical environment and see that this political crisis in Belarus is very useful to some extent for European neighbor Russian Federation. And there are 5 key elements that bring Belarus closer to Russia. The first is that Belarus, unfortunately, but is already considered a sphere of influence of Russia. It is considered by Russia as such, and unfortunately by some Western European politicians as well. I think the example when Chancellor Angela Merkel cannot reach Alexander Lukashenko in the beginning of the events and then calls to Vladimir Putin is a signal in itself to see that to some extent these areas of influences are already accepted. And I think this is a false approach to the Belarusian current events. The second element is that for the last 26 years, Alexander Lukashenko sought to maintain his power. And so the domestic as well as foreign policy of Belarus was concentrated on this task. Basically, all foreign policy of Belarus was to maintain Alexander Lukashenko and his regime at place, whatever happens in the world. The third is that Belarus is highly dependent on Russia economically. If we look at the trade data, if we look at the debt, how much Belarus owns of its external debt to other countries, we can see that more than 60% of its debt is owned by Russia. Basically, more than 50% of its trade goes to Russia. At the same time, Belarus is highly dependent on Russia's energy resources, oil and natural gas, where basically only Russia can supply Belarus in adequate, in sufficient quantities of these resources, while Belarus is becoming even more dependent when it is building a nuclear power plant, Ostrovets. And for this reason, Belarusian dependency on Russian technologies, fuel supply, nuclear fuel supply, as well as loans will increase because the nuclear power plant in itself costs about $10 billion US. So basically, the nuclear power plant may double Belarusian debt to Russia. So Belarus as well is a part of customs union, Eurasian Union, where basically it has the similar trading environment with Russia, but let's not forget that Eurasian Union does not function as European Union functions. Basically, there is only one important word and sayings and position. It's only Russia's position, because others have to comply for the most of the part. Belarus is only about 3.5% of Russian economy. And so it is, when we speak about possible integration of those two countries, we are a bit fooling ourselves, because the economies of such different scales cannot integrate with one another. One has to absorb the smaller economy. The fourth element is that Belarus is heavily dependent on Russian military and security, its technologies. Basically, Belarusian and Russian secret services, army, other services are basically training together, receive similar education. There is no significant distinction in the mentality of the security services and army. What is Belarus and what is Russia? To which country do they serve? At the same time, we can observe that most of the technologies in Belarusian army is obtained from Russia, and only some parts of its technologies and the infrastructure is not of Russian production. Russia also has two sites, military sites, installments in Belarus, in Baranovich and Vileika, where it is of strategic importance, those assets in Belarusian territory. And so it seems that through exercises, through greater financing from Russia, Belarusian military becomes more reliant and dependent on Russian military and Russia itself. Finally, the fifth element is that Belarus for the very long time had a suppressed identity. Basically, since the end of World War II and during the Cold War, Belarusian identity as a unique state, as a unique country, and the nation was suppressed by the Moscow, as well as the suppression continued since 1994, when basically Lukashenko came to power and reintroduced some national elements of, let's say, coat of arms, flag, other elements in the history books. You can find it, that it's basically, its whole narrative is focused on the World War II and the Soviet period. So basically Belarus, in Belarusian narrative, identity dominates Soviet or Russian narrative. Lukashenko did this on purpose because he had his personal goals to become, possibly the president of both Russia and Belarus. And only just recently, since basically 2014, after Russia's invasion in Ukraine, Belarusian government became more cautious about that. And I think only in contemporary events, what we are witnessing since the stolen election, we can identify that new Belarusian identity is being formed or is being introduced. Unfortunately, after such a long period of suppression, it has difficulties and it has to, let's say, catch up. And so the weakness of the identity basically also serves Russia's interests. So what I'm going to at the end, I want to say that all these elements are just the causes for the basically Russia's capabilities to absorb Belarus. And during the President Lukashenko's regime, he basically most of the time sought for the integration, which was basically not very possible but he had economic reasons of doing that. And now when the events happened, Russia obtained possibilities to press Lukashenko for greater integration because he feels that his position in Belarus is being threatened, and because his primary goal is to maintain in power, he tries to defend at any cost. So in my perspective, he will be willing to basically be integrated into Russia. Of course, Belarus will continue to be country on the map, but major decisions in economy and politics, I assume, will be taken in Russia, and the events and discussions to change Belarusian constitution serve those arguments. And let us not forget that just quite recently, there was a very strong signal from Russia how it sees Belarusian future. The Russian ambassador in Belarus gave as a gift for the Lukashenko maps where Belarusian regions are historically integrated into Russian Empire. So this was quite a strong messaging to understand what future holds. But as primary goal for Lukashenko is to remain in power, he might be willing to accept that future. So to sum up, Russia is very active in this political crisis, and it does what it can to press Lukashenko and keep him in power, at least to satisfy him. However, real decisions, I assume, in future will be taken by some administration which will have the control over country. And in this context, I assume that European Union position, as well as positions of the United States, is a bit too weak to have an alternative, to provide an alternative for Belarusian citizens, to provide a greater support for them and see that there are alternatives other than Russia, and these alternatives are really possible, but only with the strong positions and alternatives, the position of balancing between European Union and Russia can be achieved, what basically most of the opposition participating in the protests clearly state, that they don't want to become European Union, they don't want to become Russia, they want to have an independent foreign policy, but for the independence, there is a need for alternatives to be provided. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Giedrius, a lot for this geopolitical remarks. They were not so very optimistic, and we will return to your thesis, of course. Now I would like to invite Aliaksei Lastouski from Polotsk State University. Aliaksei, I think it's perfectly well known also here in Vilnius, in Kaunas, as sociologist, as a researcher. He collaborated during a long time with European Humanity University. The topic of Mr. Lastouski's decentralization, local communities, and nation buildings. Aliaksei, floor is yours. It's a big pleasure to host you today, and we are really very interesting about your view to current event in Belarus.
Thank you, Andrzej. Thank you for invitation to take part in this conversation. But I would like to totally change perspective or focus our discussion, because for me, a Russian role is important for Belarusian events, but I would like not to totalize it, that everything is in Russian will. For me, the most important thing that we can see now is that Belarus is awakening and we are building new identity, and Russia is out of game in this process. So I'd like to say some words about organizational aspects of the protest movements in Belarus, because we can see key shifts here, because it's something special, something new, and is not in usual logics of contestation of democratic opposition, because members of the National Democratic Opposition were protesting in the streets against Lukashenko for last 25 years. But we see that these protests reached a much larger number of people than traditional 15% support for the opposition. And important gap also took place in organizational formats, which I now want to talk about. I think that everyone here has heard about so-called Twitter revolutions. And for the first time, we can say that such kind of new wave protests took place in Belarus as well. And it is not only about the fact that the mobilization take place using the internet. Previous history of protest in Belarus has centered around a stable core of political organizations. Politicians called people to the streets. The gathering place was clearly defined, and violent confrontation in the streets was assumed in the form of violent dispersal of participants. And in recent years, only a few thousand people attended the opposition rallies. And why are we now see such an unexpected and even fantastic surge in mobilization? Naturally, the violence used by security forces also played a role here. But it is important that the format of mobilization has changed. Now we can talk about decentralization of protest and absence of a single coordinating center. The fact that Tikhanovskaya practically withdrew immediately after August 9 elections in protest also played a role here. Protesters were left on their own, and if on the first night after the elections, the usual scheme worked with a single gathering point, then the next days the principle changed to local rallies and a quick change in the localization of protests. The main role of coordination was taken by Next Telegram channel, but I want to point out the situation is much more complicated. Many Next directives by Telegram channel worked perfectly, especially when we talk about gathering points. But many of Next directives seem too radical and were simply sabotaged by protesters. And the actual absence of a single coordinating center gave chances for self-organization. Small outbreaks of protests that arose in micro-communities. In fact, in recent years in Belarus, we can see a steady growth of grassroots initiatives where various projects are coordinated and implemented using the internet. Publication of books, creating of theatrical performances, payment of fines for unjustly convicted, and so on. And this accumulated experience of cooperation and social networks has become an important resource for changing the format of protests. The coordination of the protest has been split into many micro-communities where people united at their place of residence, place of work, or common views. And for authorities, this decentralization has also become an obvious problem because there is no leader who can be arrested. Another thing is that the absence of single coordination center has its own obvious problems. How can efforts of many people be transformed into a single political action? So people are involved in self-organization, building of stable horizontal ties of interaction and support. First of all, we can see effective microcommunities at the local level, which hold concerts, lectures, or even joint tea parties. But even such innocent actions destroy the values of the authoritarian regime. For a long time, Lukashenko built the identity of Belarusians as subjects of his rule. We were provided with a comfortable and peaceful existence through complete loyalty. And now this social contract is collapsing, and we see how politics in Belarus is gradually reviving as Vitaktiva when people begin to realize their responsibilities. Demonstrators have almost no social or economical slogans. They're talking about political and civic issues, the return of the rule of law, insulted dignity, and we are witnessing the beginning of construction of political structures that should have been, but in fact were suppressed by the state. But in any case, this is an unprecedented event in the history of Belarus when we see how political space is reborn. And my main thesis is that Belarusians are now actively completing their civic identity, and I see that there is no future for Lukashenko in this new Belarus. Thank you.
Thank you, Alexei, a lot for this another perspective than Giedrius. And now I'm inviting Sima Rakutienė, the head of Department of Regional Studies of Vytautas Magnus University. Sima's specialization is European studies, European Union institutions. So with big pleasure, I would like to invite her to present the third perspective of Belarusian issues. The name of the title of Sima's speech is Positions of European Union Institutions Toward Russia and Belarus. Sima, you are welcome. Floor is yours.
Okay. Hello, good day to everyone. Can you hear me?
Sure, yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I would probably speak more about the attitude and approaches, not different positions, but well, generally when we discuss the EU's attitudes towards any foreign country, we should certainly consider the positions of 27 member states, and probably their representative, this president of European Council at the moment, Charles Michel, in his rhetorics probably the best reflects that common denominator of 27 member states. Then there is also High Representative Josep Borrell at the moment with his role to combine the positions of member states and the European Commission. And finally, we also find the resolutions of the European Parliament, which usually have quite strong focus on human rights and democracy issues. And therefore, it is natural that we find much of diversity within these different EU's actors' points of view. But the question is, so what is in common? And I'll try briefly to review and probably to remind that common policy and approaches of the EU's towards Belarus. And keeping in mind that the European Union is an economic but also a normative power, we find the EU's economic and normative approaches based on positive or negative conditionality or incentives, well, towards Belarus as towards any other foreign country. And if we consider the last decade or even the last 15 years of the EU's relations with Belarus, they have been based, as I find, on 3 approaches or strategies and 2 policies. And I'll just briefly remind each of these. So the 2 policies are firstly the European neighborhood policy, and secondly the Eastern Partnership. And we know that since 2004, the European Union established this European neighborhood policy involving 16 neighborhood countries from the east and from the south, including Belarus. And later in 2009, the Eastern Partnership was established, and from that time is seen as so-called Eastern dimension of European neighborhood policy. Well, both policies are quite similar in their approach towards neighboring countries and democratization, and also is called association agenda, with the main strategy as being integration without full enlargement or non-membership based integration, which is based on so-called more for more principle. And this might be entitled as an existing key strategy of the European Union towards the countries participating in these neighborhood policies. Now, analyzing the case of Belarus in the context of these policies, we find that Belarus is the only country of the 6 Eastern Partnership states which have not had institutionalized relations with the EU. And as we remember, the Cooperation and Partnership Agreement was frozen since 1995. Then European Neighborhood Policy Action Plan was not signed with Belarus either, making it the only exception comparable actually to Syria and Libya, who did not sign these ENP action plans alongside. And probably the very recent achievements have been the visa facilitation and readmission agreements with Belarus, which entered into force quite recently from the 1st of July in 2020. And these agreements target this traveling civil society issues and reflect also this EU's approach, in a sense, to make the different points towards the regime and the civil society groups. And therefore, to mention these 3 approaches, which more or less are adapted or have been adapted by the EU towards the Belarus within the last 15 years, I believe they are. The first is a sanctioning of Belarus political regime, not recognizing political class as being legitimate. Second approach is political and financial support for civil society organizations. And the third approach is what can be called as project-based approach, considering politically not sensitive areas, which involves, as in this rhetorics of the EU, technical support and exchanges between senior officials. And what I noticed that actually right now we also may find the same kind of 3 different approaches. So this sanctioning of Belarus political regime, not recognizing political class, and we frequently have heard from European Parliament, also from EU member states, they certainly do not recognize Lukashenko as elected president and do not see him as legitimate one. But actually, the similar approach have been taken previously as well, especially by the European Parliament, and example might be Euronest. This is a parliamentary dimension of the Eastern Partnership established by the European Parliament, and since its establishment, actually the parliamentarians of other 5 Eastern Partnership countries have been taking part. But the parliamentarians from the Belarus were not invited as they were not seen as legitimate. Once even we heard some critiques from experts that Belarus is a quite similar case to Armenia or Azerbaijan in a sense of having features of autocratic regime. And so considering this sanctioning and not recognizing political class, this is we actually follow and notice in current days as well. And as Josep Borrell noted, I'll cite him, we have clearly said that Alexander Lukashenko lacks any democratic legitimacy. Now, considering the second approach or strategy, that is support, political and financial support for civil society organizations. And as it is indicated in EU documents, EU sees it as an important instrument because it sometimes is the only one source to survive for these organizations, for civil society organizations, for independent media organizations. Well, as an example, I found that, let's say in 2014, 5.5 million financial support were devoted to civil society organizations. Then additionally, of course, different member states also financially support these organizations, among them Netherlands, Sweden, Poland. In the documents have been indicated as the largest contributors. And considering the recent plan, as EU indicates, following the 2020 presidential election, the Commission reacted and prepared a package of 53.7 million, which includes the assistance to the victims of repression, supporting independent media, and so-called emergency and resilience assistance to support health sector, small and medium enterprises, and so on. Now, considering this second approach, support for civil society organizations, I think right now we have a bit different situation, because for the first time we find the unity of Belarusian civil society, while previously the problematic issue has been the quite big division of opposition and civil society organizations, and now probably there is a different situation. And finally, the third approach, it's more this project-based approach, technical support. Here is example, the EU for Business initiative, which supports private sector development. As an example, that 900 enterprises have so far benefited from loans, trainings, and advice. So I would like to finish this short speech probably reminding the classical theory of political change, and probably we may consider, so what are the influential actors? So in that classical theory of political change, it is notified that in order to have it, first of all, it should be a political demand. And that political demand should be followed by social mobilization. And finally, it should have a political opportunity to make a change. So as we have heard from the presentation of Aliaksei, probably the difference of today's situation in Belarus is that we notify this quite enormous and continuous social mobilization of actually different forms in the streets, on internet, in the media, and of course it has been impacted by a very big political demand. But the question is whether political opportunity will occur. Is it possible, and what factors could make it? And that is a question. And finally, I believe that from the point of the European Union, the biggest seeking is that EU will try to do everything to avoid Ukrainian scenario with blood and armed conflict. Yes, so thanks.
Thank you, Sima, a lot for this European perspective, if I can call in this way. Also together with us is Tatsiana Chulitskaya, researcher and teacher from our Vytauto University from Department of Political Science. Tatsiana, you are really welcome here. And I would like to ask, do you have speech, or you would like to say now some comments to these three speeches? In which way you would like to participate? Or I think we can't hear you. Tatsiana, something is wrong. Okay, I think there are some technical problems. We have a little to wait for Tatsiana. Now I even can't see her. Let's wait for a moment for Tatsiana. I think maybe she will restart computer and we will return to our. I hope we wouldn't lose our force participate. It will be very interesting and important to hear Tatsiana position, but there are some I think technical problems with okay, let's maybe continue discussions with hope that Tatsiana will join us as quick as possible. In any case, I would like to return to Giedrius' thesis. Giedrius' speech, maybe my impressions were not correct, but Giedrius' speech in general was quite pessimistic. So Giedrius told for us that the key of Belarusian transformation is in Moscow. And I would like to remind Emmanuel Macron visit in Vilnius about 1 month ago, and Macron in Vilnius called to open dialogue with Russia. Some commenters in Vilnius tell that this is quite controversial proposition. But what is, Giedrius, your look? What is your view? Is it possible to converse, to discuss with Vladimir Putin about transformation in Russia. Also, I would like to remind that Vice Chief of Department of State Stefan Began visit also Vilnius, but also Moscow, and had talks in Kremlin. So what is your, Giedrius, position toward Russia? Is it possible to talk, to negotiate democratization process with Putin, with Kremlin?
Okay, thank you very much for your question. Well, I think we can return to the statement where I said that basically there is an acceptance to some extent that Belarus is already in the sphere influence of Russia. And the speech of Emmanuel Macron, the visits, and trying and aims to communicate with Belarus, with Lukashenko via Russia, and how to deal with the political crisis, obviously once more indicate such an approach. And I think this is a not very correct approach. As Sima mentioned, the European Union wants to avoid what happened in Ukraine, and she's absolutely right about that. But let's not forget that invasion in Ukraine happened not because of the actions of European Union, but because of the actions of Russia, of Kremlin, so in eastern Ukraine and Crimea. So I think in this context, we also have to understand that most of the possible opposition in political opposition, that the people who would be willing to replace Lukashenko, or to put Belarus on the path of democracy, also underline that there is no choice between European Union and Russia. So there is a need for discussions between European Union and Russia from their perspective, from the perspective of the quite highly ranking people I talked with from Belarus. So this is a bit surprise for me, because even this future possible political leaders see that European Union and Russia should agree on the positions where Belarus is and how to continue with it. So, and it's not like they want to decide themselves. And I very highly doubt that Russia would be willing for Belarusian democratization, because when we see what we have in Russia, there is a obvious lack of democracy and so on. So they are dealing, in most cases, they want to deal with the countries that are not really democratic, because then you achieve some agreements with the leaders, and that's enough for, their control, the control of Moscow is much higher than in democratic countries, because in democracies there are some different views, different perspectives on foreign policy, economic policies, and so on. So it's a bit difficult. And the Kremlin always says that European Union and all the rest have to avoid being involved in the processes of Belarus. Unfortunately, they are involved themselves very deeply, and I think the greater activity, even without Russia at the beginning, can be beneficial for Belarus. Very clear support, very clear will to involve in the discussions and direct contacts and messaging about possible future, and condemn very clearly directly to Lukashenko the atrocities his regime is now carrying out. So only then the Moscow will be met by the equal partner. Now it's absolute domination of Russia, and Russia doesn't talk about involvement of European Union into dealing with the crisis in Belarus. However, European Union talks about Russia's involvement in dealing in crisis in Belarus. So this is a not equal approach of the partners.
Thank you, Giedrius. I saw that Tatsiana joined us.
Yes, could you hear me now?
Sure, of course. Tatsiana, you are
great.
really welcome. I would like to remind for our listeners that Tatsiana Chulitskaya now is working in Vytauto Mažylis University in the Department of Political Science. Tatsiana, really, you are very welcome. And we are now open discussion about the role of Russia in the changes in Belarus. And I need to say that Giedrius' view, it's quite pessimistic, I need to say, maybe realistic, maybe absolutely realistic. So Giedrius' thesis is that more or less, but key of changes in Belarus is lying more in Moscow than in Brussels. So maybe we are maybe it's our demonization of Russia. How is your look of the role of Russia in this process? Maybe we are too much pessimistic. Maybe you have some more optimistic news for us when we speak about huge pressure from Kremlin to Belarus, to Belarusian events.
Yes, thank you for questions. If I may, I will jump in at least with some statements regarding geopolitical discourse and geopolitical agenda, while I have not had a chance to make my points. But I'll try to be briefly, and then I'll reflect on what Giedrius said and also on what Sima said, because I have some comments. So from the perspective of discourse analysis and from perspective of the statements which different actors are making within the current political conflict in Belarus, I should mention that of course Belarusian crisis, it caused a lot of different discussions about its geopolitical implications and geopolitical dimensions. And these questions about the role of Russia, as you have mentioned, and the role of Putin, it's really sometimes demonized or even, presented as the most important one in this conflict. And it's usually made especially from the Western perspective. I mean, when we are looking at Belarusian events and Belarusian conflict from domestic perspective, it's a kind of a paradox, but there is almost no this geopolitical dimension of this conflict. So in principle, I should say that geopolitical dimension of Belarusian election, of course, is extremely important, but it is more important for the international audience rather than for people inside Belarus themselves. In principle, even during the electoral campaign, the main Lukashenko's opponents, at the beginning it was Babarika Tsipkala and Tikhanovsky himself, they remained almost silent about foreign policy issues. Also, the very personality of Babarika, for instance, and to some extent of Tikhanovsky, they were presented by Belarusian official propaganda as well as by some independent experts as a kind of a Russian foreign agent, and that was a presentation of these alternative candidates. But after the arrest of this and non-registration of these three main male alternative candidates and appearance of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya and her female mates as the main oppositional leaders, all the questions of international relations and foreign policy policy, they had got secondary meaning or no meaning at all in domestic discussions. So the main messages before the elections and after the elections, they were concentrated and they are concentrated on the internal domestic developments. So after the elections, when Tikhanovskaya was forced to leave the country and mass protests started, the protests and people who participate in them, they are also internally focusing on three main issues. The first one is that Lukashenko should resign. The second one that there should be no more violence. And the third one is that there should be a new election. So within this agenda, we see these geopolitical questions or geopolitical concerns. However, if we look at activities of Svetlana Tikhanovskaya now, we see that she is rather active on the international agenda, even more active than with these domestic developments in Belarus. And her main dimension of activities is the Western dimension. However, at the same time, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya herself, she tries to balance between East and West. And when she is saying something about foreign policy, she always highlighted or emphasizes that it's important for Belarus to preserve this balanced foreign policy. So the main pro-Russian speaker and the main pro-Russian actor in Belarus is Alexander Lukashenko himself. And because of the crisis of internal and external legitimacy, he is forced to appeal to Russia and concentrate on this Russian-Belarusian relations even more. As Giedrius mentioned, indeed, for Lukashenko, this Belarus-Russian relations is the main way out of the current political crisis. However, from what we observe nowadays, relations between Putin and Lukashenko are far from cloudless. So I wouldn't say that Russia just supports Lukashenko without any conditions or just for granted. So summing up briefly from Belarusian internal perspectives and for the active Belarusian peoples themselves, the geopolitical dimension of the current conflict, it doesn't play a big role. However, I should mention that this geopolitical and special anti-Russian dimension, it may come to the protest agenda in case of more active, aggressive actions from Russian side, or, like presence of Russian military servants in Belarus and so on and so forth. When it comes to oppositional leader, Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, she intends and does participate actively in the international visits, but she promotes anyway more actively the internal Belarusian agenda, not like these foreign policy issues. And the most pro-Russian, pro-active Russian leaders in Belarus is Alexander Lukashenko, and basically if he stays in power, I would agree with this statement that it's a huge risk for Belarusian sovereignty and for Belarusian developments, for Belarus as a country. However, I'm starting to reflect to your questions. I would say that probably if we look at Belarusian events and at these Belarusian developments from not just, so realpolitik perspective, but also from the perspective of this civic mobilization. And if we think that this civic mobilization will result in positive changes, democratic changes in Belarus, then of course this agenda and this threat from Russia to Belarus, it will decrease. In case if Lukashenko is no more in power, so this pressure from Russia, it could not be the same strong as it is now. So I would say that the main or one of the main reasons why Belarus is so susceptible towards Russia is this extremely high emphasis or extremely strong emphasis of Mr. Lukashenko to Russian agenda and to this Russian-Belarusian relations. Of course, as it was also mentioned by Giedrius, economic relations and economic dimensions of Belarus-Russian relations is essential. And now, indeed, with the situation with Astravets nuclear plant station, it's even more serious. However, I should also say that like any future leader, I mean, like in Belarus, should deal somehow with this Russian agenda. However, I think that in case if there are changes, I mean, pro-democratic changes, this agenda and this like balance between in negotiations between Russia and Belarus, it might be changed. I mean, it would not stay the same with clear dominance from Russian side. That is probably my reflections on what Andrzej asked me and what Giedrius said. And if I may make some statements and some reflections on other issues, or should I wait?
Oh, sure. You're welcome. Yeah.
Yes,
but
I.
2-3 minutes, not longer.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. One more issue I would like to reflect on is this issue of Belarusian identity, because it was said somehow that now it's starting to appear, but I should say that this civic identity of Belarusian people, it has been raising for the last 26 years. I mean, it's not something that just appeared during the protest. Of course, this protest movement, they somehow mobilizes this civic identity. So I would say that in Belarus, indeed, this ethnical identity, or this, like identity with traditional ethnic, ethnic components, is really like it might be weak, and it is weak. However, when it comes to this civic identity, I would not agree that it didn't exist at all. So, and it has started to appear just now. In my opinion, it has been appearing for the last 26 years. And I would like just to make some comments on Sima's analysis. It was very interesting for me. However, I should mention about this support of civil society organizations by European Union. On the one hand, indeed, European Union has always claimed that civil society is one of the pillars of its support in Belarus. On the other hand, I should say that starting from 2015, when this European neighborhood politics, it was like reshaped a bit, then the share of support of civil society in Belarus, it has been decreasing. And it's quite a paradox. On the one hand, the European Union has always been saying that it's essential to support civil society in Belarus. However, after 2014-2015, we observe that the share of support from European Union, which goes to civil society, not to pro-governmental organization, not to public institutions in Belarus, is decreasing. For instance, in 2006-2007, it was the share of support of Belarusian civil society organizations from European money was around like 35%, and after 2017 it's just 20%. So we see like 2 times decrease of this support. When it comes to this 53 millions, it's too like also situation where just 3 millions were promised to Belarusian civil society and 50 millions for struggle with COVID. However, nowadays they are discussing what to do and maybe to spend this 53 millions for Belarusian civil society. And the last comment is about this division between civil society organizations in Belarus and political oppositions. Indeed, for a long time, this division existed. However, nowadays, I would not say that this division is overcome somehow, because nowadays we see mass mobilization and protest mobilization. But when it comes to organizations of civil society, some of them, and frankly speaking, majority of them, they are so depoliticized that they do not participate actively in this protest, in this protest movement. So, I mean, this situation with, this political participation of civil society organization in Belarus is a bit more complicated story. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Tatsiana. It's a lot of topics you opened, a lot of questions you created, but still I would like to keep this question of the role of Russia in Belarusian protests. Alexei, 2-3 minutes for your remarks, because we are discussing about 1 hour. So our time is going to the end. So Alexei, 2-3 minutes, if you can, to continue this line which we started with Giedrius, the role of Russia in the changes in Belarus, maybe our demonization of Russia from our Vilnius Lithuanian perspective, it's too big, too large. What do you think about that?
Mm-hmm. At first, I would like to say a few words about Tatsiana's remark about civic identity. I did not say that it did not exist before protest, but I said that it has been radically changed. This state of this identity is core values, is more important. And what's about role of Russia? I just want to say at first that future of Belarus will be decided in Minsk, not in Moscow, not in Brussels. And I can say that I totally agree with Tatsiana that European Union support for civil society in Belarus has radically decreased in last year. So, for example, you cannot see EU flags in protests because nobody ways that Europe will help us. So we are just for our own sake. And what's about Moscow? For me, it's very important that we cannot say that Moscow is like unified actor or Kremlin is like unity, because we can see like different forces or different lobby structures that are going to implement their strategies on Belarus, and there are two main strategies. First one is to support Lukashenko because he's like most pro-Russian politic in Belarus, like Tatsiana said, but other strategy is to change Lukashenko because he is not so useful, and support of Lukashenko demands a lot of resources from Russia because Russia has to give more money for Lukashenko, and they don't understand why we have to support this politician who cannot even solve the problem of protests in our country. So if we will track words and actions of Russian authorities in maybe last month, we can see that Russia is trying to involve strategy of like constitutional reform and next elections in Belarus. And we can see like a pressure on Lukashenko to make these changes. And we can see that Lukashenko don't want to do it, but he's slowly make some actions toward this constitutional reform and new elections. And what is good for Russia in this scenario that Belarus will be parliamentarian republic in this case, and Russia will use political parties which are pro-Russian to gain control of our country. So for me, it is also not so optimistic scenario, but for me, it's more important that we will have like a political life and challenges, and we can see that protest movement is creating a lot of people who are activists and who will be active in this new post-Lukashenko's Belarus. And for me, this scenario of constitutional reform is much more better than continuous authoritarian rule of Lukashenko.
Okay, thank you, Alexei. Sima, at last but not least, your final remarks. We had also some critical words from Tatsiana about European Union support for Belarusian civil society, but still I would like to keep this line of the role of Russia. So what is your, Sima, what is your final remarks and your thesis and your recommendation for European Union institutions? How European Union must to converse with Russia? How European Union must to deal with Kremlin, with Vladimir Putin about the changes, about reforms in Belarus?
Well, yeah, probably I would come back to what Giedrius mentioned, that probably the point is not just to put everything just on sanctioning, but also to recognize probably the role of Russia and try to speak with Vladimir Putin about some possible solution. And I think that it might be likely an opportunity that this common denominator between EU and Russia might be to say goodbye to Alexander Lukashenko. If that would also, you know, from a Russian point of view, satisfy. But I would like to disagree with the point of Tatsiana on that. She said if Lukashenko will leave, that would mean more democratization in Belarus. I wouldn't equalize that because it was mentioned also by Alexei, and even Tatsiana also mentioned this agents, yes, of Russia, and it might be that of course Russia will do everything to keep influence and to remain in you know, this political dialogue, and also to keep influence on the Belarus. So I think that it might be this common denominator, what's considering the role of Alexander Lukashenko, but considering the geopolitics, political change, that is an entirely different question. And the other issue that we should keep in mind that the politics of European Union, I think that in most of the ways is a reactive. If there is a strong expectation, a political demand which is coming from that specific country, then European Union is reacting. Now, what we hear from the Belarusian point of view, if we take into account the civil society organizations, these opposition groups, what we hear that the main requirement is to dismiss Alexander Lukashenko, that he should leave the political scene. So if that happens, so it seems like it might satisfy, but at the same time, that doesn't mean the future democratization of this country. That is entirely different question. So considering the point of the European Union, I think that it's quite important what is that specific demand of the civil society, of opposition, as Tatsiana notified, internal reforms and so on. But what is precisely expected from the European Union? What are the expectations? What are the demands? So that is quite important, issues to consider.
So, dear colleagues, thank you a lot. I think our time is going to the end. A lot of different questions, a lot of different problems. Our panel was called Russia's Behaviors in the Context of Belarus Events and EU Perspective, but I think we even opened really more questions about Belarusian identity, about condition of civil society, about influence of not only Russia, but also another factors. So I would like to remind once more that today with us were Tatsiana Chulitskaya from Vytauto University, Aliaksei Lastouski from Polotsko State University, Sima Rakutienė also from Vytauto University, Giedrius Česnakas from Generolo Jono Žemaičio Military Academy in Vilnius. Dear Liudas, thank you a lot for possibility. And we have hope that this is not our last meeting. We really need such conversations, such changing of ideas. So thank you for all European Parliament member team, especially for Dominikas Juškis for his technical support. And see you soon until next meetings. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.